I am 45 years old, and for about half of my life I worked as a night guard in the City Museum of Local Lore. The work was for me no stress, just watch the cameras and walk around the premises with a flashlight a couple of times a night. For as long as I can remember, I have always shunned people and preferred to sleep during the day rather than at night. Perhaps someone else would have been frightened by the prospect of being in a large museum all alone all night, but I definitely didn't feel lonely, and books, a radio, and a tablet brightened up my leisure time perfectly. In general, he held on to his work with both hands. But a couple of nights last week made me run away from this damned institution without even writing a letter of resignation. It all started with the fact that a new exhibit appeared in the museum, the mummy of an ancient warrior. Archaeologists dug it up not in Egypt, as one might think, but somewhere in the Altai mountains, where several thousand years ago it was also customary to embalm the dead before burial. They say that when scientists discovered several such mummies in the mid-90s and transported them to research institutes for study, natural disasters began to occur one after another in Altai. However, archaeologists then convinced all the superstitious that this was nothing more than a coincidence. But the locals were sure that having disturbed the remains of their ancestors, the scientists brought a curse not only on the Altai land, but also on everyone involved in this outrage. As the stand in the exhibition hall informed, together with a warrior who died quite young, weapons, various valuables, and even the body of a real horse were found in the burial ground. All this, according to the ideas of the ancient inhabitants of Altai, should have been useful to the guy in the other world. The mummy did not look like the creatures we are used to seeing in horror films, but to me it looked even more creepy. Thanks to the permafrost in which the tomb was found, the body was well preserved, and even the tattoo on which griffins tear apart prey was clearly visible on it. No bandages, only dried dead flesh, through which bones were visible in some places, and a skull with empty eye sockets and an eerie smile. Muscles and even hair were also preserved in some places on the head of the dead man, which gave him a particularly disgusting and frightening appearance. This guy was lying on a pedestal in the fetal position, as he was found in the burial ground. To prevent further decomposition, the Altai mummy was covered with a thick glass box under which the necessary microclimate was maintained. In general, the spectacle was vile, but people liked it. Since the mummy was put up in the museum, people poured in a crowd. Whole families came, brought school classes and groups of students on excursions. Visitors of all ages stared at the mummified remains, took numerous videos and photos, and even shared selfies with the withered corpse. And of course, jokes of varying degrees of wit were soaked. I never understood where the line was drawn between a dead body requiring respect and proper burial in the ground, and a museum exhibit, forever doomed to entertain the public with its unsightly appearance. As if the body was buried not yesterday, but thousands of years ago, all the rules of decency and tradition ceased to apply to it. However, my business was small. It's not for the security guard to teach highbrow researchers and museum workers what they can do and what they can't. A separate room was allocated for the mummy, and the authorities ordered me to watch it especially closely. The goal was considered a world scientific sensation, and therefore there could be those who wanted to steal this decayed value and sell it on the black market. I didn't like to be in this hall, although I am not one of the cowardly. It was such a pleasure to look at the terrible physiognomy in the dark. I examined the hall purely formally, and what could happen? The windows were controlled by an alarm system, 2 cameras were watching the hall, and the museum is located in the very center of the city. Who would dare to rob it? But as it turned out, the danger lurked not outside, but inside the museum walls. I began to notice the first oddities within a couple of days after the opening of the exhibition. Every time I looked at the box with the mummy at night, I noticed that it seemed to change its position a little. It was barely noticeable, but still I was sure that the day before she lay a little differently. At first, I thought that the museum workers periodically carry out some manipulations with the mummy, which makes it move a little. But when I asked one of the museum workers about this, I received an unexpected answer: all personnel are strictly forbidden to open the glass box. Well, these oddities could be explained in another way. Perhaps the mummy shifts slightly from the vibration created by the subway passing under the museum. Probably many have heard the story of a spontaneously rotating Egyptian figurine in one of the English museums. Then many explained this by the curse of the pharaohs and the like paranormal. And the fault was the traffic near the museum and the steps of visitors, which created this very vibration. And yet I began to look more closely at the hall with our guest from antiquity. From a certain moment, I began to notice barely noticeable movements on cuff cameras. Each time, I saw them only with peripheral vision when I looked at another monitor, and therefore could not understand what exactly happened. At some point, sound visions began to be added to my visual visions. Every night I began to hear a barely perceptible whisper in the museum. The sound was very quiet, it could only be heard in complete silence, and rather it resembled the rustling of leaves in the wind. But occasionally in this sound stream, I distinguished clearly pronounced, albeit incomprehensible words. I drove stupid superstitious thoughts away from myself, and yet I felt that with the appearance of the mummy in this hall it became restless. I could not share my thoughts with anyone. Any colleague would immediately decide that it was time for the aging night guard to retire. To be honest, I myself began to lean towards this, because I had never imagined anything like this before. I really thought about making an appointment with a doctor, but on my next shift something happened that could not be explained by any problems with memory or the psyche. On that day, while looking around the museum with a flashlight, I heard somewhere in the distance a quiet rustle. Looking around, I realized that the sound was coming from the hall of the mummy. It was like the scraping of the claws of a mouse digging a mink. For 2 decades of work in the museum, I have not met a single rodent, and here on you. But as soon as I opened the door of the hall and directed the beam of the lantern there, the sounds instantly subsided. I carefully examined the room but found no traces of mice. But as soon as I closed the door and went to other rooms, a loud ringing sounded behind me. I again ran into the hall and saw that the glass box with which the mummy was covered was lying on the floor. At the same time, the mummy itself remained in place, still in the same familiar position. To say I was puzzled is an understatement. All I hoped for at that moment was that one of my colleagues would run out from behind the curtain and say with a laugh that it was a prank. Although who would be so bold and ridiculous to play me, and even with the risk of dismissal. But then how to explain the fall of the glass? As instructed, I was to contact the head of security. But after a little thought, I still decided not to tell anyone about the incident and simply returned the glass to its place. Would anyone believe that the glass itself, for some unknown reason, fell off the pedestal and even flew off a couple of meters? They will decide that I myself, due to my clumsiness, dropped the glass and decided to blame everything on otherworldly forces. To make a long story short, I spent the rest of the night watching just this one room through the video recording system. The infrared picture on the monitor was absolutely static, but as soon as I looked away, I noticed some movement in my peripheral vision. I sharply turned my head back, and there is no movement, and the ugly creature still lies quietly in its glass sarcophagus. In general, the very whisper, to which I even managed to get used a little, was especially loud that night, and even my radio could not drown it out completely. Now in this sound I could hear not only words unfamiliar to me, but also emotions. It was felt that the whisperer seemed to be asking for help, suffering, and cursing his fate. To be honest, I went out to the next night shift with genuine fear. I understood that I would still suffer a lot from our Altai guest, but I could not even imagine what awaited me that night. The first few hours were quiet. Then I went out to inspect the premises and again heard the rustle. This time, I immediately understood where it was coming from, and moved into the hall with the mummy. The rustle subsided as soon as I crossed the threshold of the hall. But now I was not going to give up so easily and decided to deal with all this devilry at all costs. I sat down on the caretaker's chair, pointed the lantern at the mummy, and began to watch her without interruption, without turning my head away for a second. But either this tense surveillance of a motionless object or the absence of the usual coffee and music influenced me, but soon my eyelids began to stick together. It seemed to me that I literally fell asleep for a moment, but when I opened my eyes I experienced a real shock. The glass box in which the mummy had just been was now empty. Thoughts and questions flashed through my head in a panic. Where is the mummy? Who could so quietly pass me by and pick it up? What will they do with me if I don't find it? Having mastered myself, the first thing I decided to do was to view the recording from the surveillance camera. But I did not find an answer to my questions. The camera recorded how I fell asleep, and then for several minutes it gave out only interference. When the image finally returned, I saw only a shadow in the moonlight gliding across the threshold of the hall. The box was empty by now. I checked both front doors. They were, as before, locked from the inside. The alarm also worked well. All this spoke of one thing: the mummy remains somewhere in the museum. Turning on the lights in all the rooms, I went in a hurry to search for museum value. Deep down I didn't understand what I was more afraid of: not finding it, or, on the contrary, finding. I went around the museum room after room, trying to find the loss among the amphoras, swords and coins. Suddenly, the lights in the entire museum began to tremble, and surprisingly my flashlight did the same. A few seconds later, the flickering was replaced by pitch darkness. And suddenly I heard slow steps behind me. Judging by the sound, these were not the steps of bare feet, but they were not in shoes either. They rather resembled a knock on the floor of a tree. Or bare bones. My heart began to beat as if it wanted to jump out of my chest, because I heard this something approaching me. Overcoming my numbness, I slowly turned around and, with eyes accustomed to the darkness, saw what I feared most. In front of me on two legs stood the same half-decayed mummy. Empty eye sockets looked lifelessly at me, and hands reached out in my direction. The creature's mouth opened several times, whispering in a language I didn't know. After that, this creature grabbed my throat with both hands. I tried with all my might to escape from her deadly embrace, but the dead man possessed incredible strength for his withered body. Then I grabbed my only weapon, a club hanging from my belt, and from the last of these hit the mummy on the hands. The creature's left hand made a crunching noise, its grip loosened, and I managed to break free. I ran as fast as I could to the front door of the museum, literally flew out into the street, and, without turning around, rushed home. Only when I ran into my apartment and closed the door with all the locks, I felt safe and took a breath. Of course, I never returned to the museum. A few days later I heard rumors. The workers found the museum in the morning in a normal state, only the front door was open, and the light was on in all rooms. The Altai mummy lay in its place under the glass, and only a small dent was noticed on her hand, but they attributed it to natural causes. No one could understand where the night guard had gone. I did not answer calls and messages to anyone. There was only one thing that worried me. They quickly found a replacement for me, a very young boy. He could not even imagine what trials would await him at night, and it is not at all a fact that he would be able to get out of them. Like me, alive. I felt sorry for the boy, and one night I decided to warn him about the mortal danger that threatened him. I almost entered the museum, but I glanced briefly at one of the windows on the second floor, and froze with horror. In the dark window I saw that very ancient dead man. He seemed to be smiling at me with his sinister grin, slightly tilting his head to the side. The mummy did not say anything, but I seemed to hear a voice in my head: "Don't bother me." After standing a little in front of the front door of the museum, I turned around and wandered towards the house. What happened to the new night guard remains a mystery to me. But I'm afraid that the ancient Siberian warrior took revenge on him for his disturbed peace.